The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path. A path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Today's episode is Planet Narnia.
Hello, everyone. Wade Franson here with Created in the Image of God. This morning, I have a wonderful guest, one I've been very much looking forward to meeting and discussing, because he has focused on a world, a universe even, that I was aware of, but have not personally, delved into. And so I expect to learn a lot this morning, along with you, the audience, when we talk to Michael Ward. Michael Ward is a theologian, but also a literary scholar, and he's a leading voice in C.S. Lewis studies. And I'm sure that name resonates with everybody, but today we're going to really learn about the depth of it. He has served as an associate member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Oxford. He's best known as the award-winning author of Planet Narnia, the Seven Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis. He's also the co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis. So he brings together deep theological insight with a rich appreciation for what C.S. Lewis did with this work. Welcome to the studio, Michael.
Thank you, Wade. Good to be with you.
Well, by way of introduction to the topic, I remember reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe at a very young age, and I had no idea it had anything to do with religion. And I was myself not from a religious family, wouldn't have meant much to me if I had known what was behind it. But I remember being sucked in and fascinated with this book, and remember a lot of the details. I was an avid reader there in third and fourth grade, and I don't remember, I was kind of reading above my level. I don't remember there being a big series or even knowing how I got a hold of that book and read it, but it was, really captured my imagination. And only much later did I learn about where some of this was coming from. That may be by way of introduction and segue into your own creation story. What was it like growing up, Michael? Who were your parents? Where were you born? Tell us a little bit about those early years and the forces that shaped you.
Thank you. I was born in the south of England, in the county of Sussex, halfway between London and Brighton, in a little village called Lindfield, a medieval village with an ancient parish church and a village green and a village pond and thatched cottages. A beautiful place. My parents were Keith and Olive. My dad was a local teacher of mathematics at the local high school, and my mum, when she worked outside the family, was a nurse. I have two older brothers. My parents were very devout Anglican Christians of the more evangelical end of Anglicanism. And so I was baptized as an infant and taken to church, a very lively local Anglican church. And one of the most formative things in my early years was that my parents read to me and to my brothers the Narnia books by C.S. Lewis, and I liked them. I have fond memories of jumping into my parents' bed with my two brothers on a Saturday or a Sunday morning, and my mum reading a chapter or two of the latest Narnia Chronicle before we all got up, had breakfast, and went about our day's activities. And I remember in particular being intrigued that there was a second level of meaning to the Narnia books, because my parents told me just enough to tip me off that there was a sort of biblical parallel in the story, that Aslan, the lion, was a bit like Jesus, and the white witch was a bit like the devil. They didn't say much more than that, actually, but that was enough to hook me, because I wasn't used to stories having more than one level. And as soon as I was old enough to read the Narnia Chronicles for myself, I did so repeatedly, and then got into Lewis's other fiction and his Christian apologetics, and always loved Lewis both for his literary side and for his theological side. Those are always my two strong subjects, literature and RE, religious education, as we would call it in England. And so I did my first degree in English, and I wanted to go to Oxford because Lewis was associated above all places with Oxford. I was fortunate to do my English degree at Oxford, and I studied Lewis officially, formally, for that degree. I did a short undergraduate thesis on him. And after I graduated, I was asked to give a one-off lecture and then a short bit of tuition. And little by little, my knowledge of it and expertise in C.S. Lewis grew, and I ended up living in his house for 3 years, his former residence, the Kilns. I was the kind of warden of that property for 3 years, sleeping in Lewis's old bedroom and having his study as my study. That was a great privilege. And then when it came time for me to do my PhD, C.S. Lewis was obviously the choice that I should make, because I was already very familiar with his work. And then halfway through my researches, I stumbled across this additional key to the Narnia books. There's not just 2 levels in those stories, there are 3 levels. And I unearthed what I believe to be this 3rd level, and that's what my book, Planet Narnia, The 7 Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis, is all about.
Amazing. So I'm actually just returning from a trip to Sweden, where I took my family, and I'd been there many times. I went to school 4th, 5th, and 6th grade there, but my family had never been there. And on the trip to visit one of my aunts and uncles, we stopped at the graveyard where my grandparents were buried, and I was kind of shocked to know that the church there was 700 years old. And it just clicked to me, oh yes, Sweden has a much richer history. We've just celebrated the 250th anniversary of this country that I live in now. But you mentioned medieval. How old were the elements of your surroundings growing up when you say medieval village?
Well, I think the oldest bit of the parish church is 12th century. That is to say, the 1100s. But I think the settlement of Lindfield, the village where I grew up, is 9th century or even 8th, I forget. But a very ancient place, even by English standards. That's a pretty well-established little hamlet. By the time I was living there, it was almost a deep suburb of London. A lot of businessmen who worked in London would live in Lindfield because there was a good railway connection. You could be in the center of London in 45 minutes, which by American standards is next door, I know, but by English standards that's still quite a long way even now.
So the village was over 1,000 years old. This framework that is the 3rd level of Lewis's novels, the 7 heavens. Where does that come from in history?
Well, in a way, it comes from time immemorial, but it also has a root in classical mythology and a major flourishing and flowering in the Middle Ages itself, under writers like Dante and Chaucer. So the 7 heavens C.S. Lewis described as spiritual symbols of permanent value. And the 7 planets are the wandering stars. That's what a planet literally is, a wanderer. And these are the celestial bodies that can be seen with the naked eye. So this is why it goes back to time immemorial, before the invention of the telescope. And these 7 celestial bodies are wanderers, not stars. So that all the other celestial bodies are stars fixed in their constellations. But the seven heavens are the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And it's from these seven heavens that we take the names of the days of the week. And it's not just in English that you see that connection, but in quite a lot of other languages too around the world, including, you know, the Far East. I'm told that the Japanese language also names the days of the week after these seven planets. So, you know, it's a global phenomenon down through history all across the world that these seven celestial bodies are particularly significant. And over time, as people stared at them and looked at them and considered them and their various properties and how they behaved in the night sky and so on, gradually they became associated with different properties, with different characteristics and attributes. And so this idea of their influences grew, that the sun, of course, being golden, was associated with the metal of gold, and therefore with wealth and treasure and generosity and providence and illumination, not just of the mind but of the spirit. So the heaven of the sun became the heaven of theologians and philosophers. And for instance, Saturn can only just be seen with the naked eye, and it's very faint and dim and distant and moves slowly. So it naturally became associated with death and disaster. You know, why is this planet so sluggish and slow? Perhaps it's carrying a heavy load, so it became associated with the metal of lead, the heaviness of lead and the dullness of lead. So little by little there was this accretion of symbolic properties and associations that clustered around these seven heavens. And that's why Lewis calls them spiritual symbols of permanent value. You can, in his view, as it were, divide up the whole of our spiritual experience as human beings into one or other of these seven categories. Everything from birth under Venus. Venus was associated with fertility and life and love and laughter and beauty and sexuality, creativity. Think of the word venerate. When you venerate someone, you lovingly respect them because Venus is inspiring your veneration. When you contract a venereal disease, you are also doing something under the influence of Venus that you probably shouldn't be doing. So the traces linger in our language of these planetary properties, these astrological properties. And as I say, everything from birth under Venus all the way through to death under Saturn can be symbolized in these ways. And so Lewis wrote about this heptarchy, as it's called, extensively in his academic works as a medieval literary historian at Oxford. But he also responded to them imaginatively, and so he used them very extensively in his Ransom trilogy, the 3 books of planetary adventure that he wrote. He put them into his poetry. He was actually quite a keen amateur astronomer. He had a telescope on the balcony of his bedroom. He knew his stars and his planets pretty well. Would often write about unusual conjunctions in the night sky. And furthermore, he liked artistic interpretations, such as Holst's musical setting of the planets in his famous Planets Suite, a work that moved Lewis greatly. He thought it was a rich and marvelous work. And then more theologically, in Lewis's Christian life, he said that the greatest psalm in the Psalter was Psalm 19. It's the greatest poem in the book of Psalms and one of the greatest lyrics in the world. And of course, it's that psalm that begins, "The heavens are telling the glory of God. The firmament proclaims his handiwork." So all these things show that Lewis was absolutely steeped in this old cosmology. He didn't believe it was literally true, of course. You know, he accepted the Copernican revolution, that the sun is actually at the center of our solar system, and the sun does not go around the Earth, even though it looks like it does. We go around the sun. So he was content to accept the scientific advance brought about by Copernicus, of course. But he nonetheless thought that the pre-Copernican cosmos, because of its spiritual interpretation of material reality conveyed an attitude to the universe which was worth retaining, and which in some ways we have lost as science has progressed. Science has, in some measure, de-spiritualized or disenchanted the universe, and we now tend to think much more purely in materialistic terms, in terms of quantity. Where are the stars? What are they made of? How quickly do they move? How far away are they? Those sorts of strictly astronomical questions. Whereas Lewis thought that astrological questions, asking about the qualities and their spiritual connection to man and why they've been made, who made them, for whom were they made, what do they signify, those sorts of questions were also valid questions. I mean, he wasn't a signed up astrologer by any means, and he would have looked very askance at those, you know, silly horoscopes in the back pages of magazines. That's not what he means by astrology. He just means study of the stars, and that kind of meaningful inquiry into what the stars are there for is, in his view, a very Christian biblical attitude to strike. You know, the wise men in Matthew's gospel who follow the star to Bethlehem were astrologers, and their astrology led them to worship the newborn Christ. And so Lewis saw no conflict between astrology in this sense and his own Christian faith.
Well, this is fascinating. I hadn't expected immediately to get into such a rich discussion. You'll see behind me on the wall the sun and the moon. And I don't know if you can see the whole thing in this view, just in case. There it is. And below it, me with my daughter, a little picture for those who care about minutia. A couple of touch points for the experience we have on this planet. What I have that there for is a constant reminder that in the first verses of Genesis, it says God placed the greater and lesser lights in heaven to rule the day and rule the night. Now, I recently had Gary Rensburg on the show. I don't know if you know who he is. He is an Old Testament scholar, also a scholar of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But he has a particular theory that the books of Moses were redacted and compiled under David's reign, and that the creation of the two creation stories, Genesis 1 through 1:4a and 1:4b, then on into, or excuse me, through Genesis 2:4a, the dividing point being, thus God created the heavens and the earth, and then in the day that he created the earth and the heavens, switches the viewpoint from the cosmological to the geocentric. And it's a retelling of the creation story in completely different terms and symbols, to give two different perspectives. But one of the points he makes is that the editors specifically called them the greater and lesser lights to remove the names sun and moon, which of course have other gods associated with them, so that the editor, if you will, the redactor of the first couple of chapters of Genesis, wanted to make sure that every mention of any other god was removed from the telling of the story. I find this fascinating, whether it's true or not. I tend to agree with his theory there. But what's fascinating further is how, those bodies are put in the heavens for days, seasons, signs, and times. And you mentioned the Magi, right, who I understand to be Zoroastrian priests, the wise men from the East. My fantasy there is that they had access to Daniel's works, and they were combining their own astrology with the work of Daniel, who then, and through these different pieces, were able to triangulate and arrive in Jerusalem. Again, I don't know, probably completely unprovable, but there's evidence that, this is at play there. And please, I'll have you comment on whether you've seen or heard any of that, if you have an opinion on it. But I wanted to mention one more thing, and that is my son, when he was 2, would ask why like 20 times, and whatever you told him as an answer, he would simply say why. And I tried to continue with that, and it wasn't a game to him. He was serious. He was only 2, and he was serious. Why, Dad? Why is that? But the point is, he was trying to make sense of things, and he would come up with some pretty fantastical ideas sometimes as he was listening to these answers and then coming up with his own version of reality. When you talk about the depth and the richness of human observation of the heavens, and then these frameworks that were then created over the potentially millennia, assigning meaning and interpretation, I'm reminded of that. But there's value in those early probings, and there was certainly inspiration and revelation coming from the divine that was guiding us through that early childhood, if you will, of civilization prior to the Copernican revolution. These were just some of the thoughts I was having as you were talking. I'll let you now respond to all of that.
Thank you. Yes, I'm not a biblical scholar myself, let alone a Hebrew specialist, so I can't speak to that particular interpretation of Genesis. But your mentioning of the fact that the sun and the moon in particular are created for signs and for seasons, the sun to rule the day and the moon to rule the night, is an interesting starting point. And it really runs throughout the Bible that the stars and the planets they're not just random bits of rock and gas floating above our head. They are in a meaningful relationship with us. I've already mentioned Psalm 19, and we've talked about the Magi from the east.
Day after day, their speech pours forth, and knowledge night after night. And yet they have no words, yet they proclaim.
Exactly. And that's, I think, a very significant aspect of the heavenly language from Lewis's point of view, that there is no literal speech. Their voice is not heard with the literal ear, yet their voice goes out through all the earth and their words to the ends of the world. So he who has ears to hear, let him hear. In other words, spiritual things are spiritually discerned. And that's a major aspect of what Lewis is up to, I believe, when he comes to write the Narnia Chronicles. And we'll perhaps come back to that in a moment. But first, just to have a quick trot through some of the other scriptural references which are relevant in this regard. In the book of Judges, there's a very intriguing reference to how the stars in their courses were fighting against Sisera, Sisera being the commander of the armies opposing the people of Israel. So the stars were somehow thought to be involved in a military battle here on earth, which is very, very intriguing verse. Lewis actually alludes to it in one of his novels. And then if you come to the last book of the Old Testament, the book of Malachi, we read that the Sun of Righteousness shall rise with healing in its wings, which provides a nice springboard into what Jesus says in John's Gospel, I am the light of the world. So this idea of a solar theophany, a sort of divine manifestation in the literal, the materialistic light of the world, the actual thing that is giving us literal light, and associating that with the divine figure, that the sun is actually just a manifestation of a greater God, the God who made the sun. The sun itself is not to be worshipped. That's a significant aspect of the whole picture. And then if we zoom up to the book of Revelation, we're told about the Son of Man who's holding the 7 stars in his right hand. And like a lot of apocalyptic imagery, there are numerous proposed interpretations of what that means. But one interpretation, which was advanced actually by C.S. Lewis's colleague and friend Austin Farrer, is that these 7 stars that Christ, the Son of Man, is holding are indeed the 7 planets from which we take the names of the days of the week. and that this picture of the Son of Man holding them in his right hand is an indication that Christ is the Lord of time, that all our days are in his grasp. There are, of course, alternative interpretations, but all of that is just to say, across the sweep of the Bible, there's this deep interest in and an attempt to understand the significance of what is going on above us in the sky. And it's unfortunate, really, that astrology has now become a sort of dirty word, and that Christians especially think of it as just, well, either at the worst, a sort of occult practice, which is spiritually dangerous, or the least bad, superstitious nonsense, which is just a trivial silliness. But C.S. Lewis, being a medieval scholar, had a much more balanced, I think, and grounded understanding of astrology. He says that in the 16th century, of which century he'd made a special study, that astrology and astronomy were basically one discipline. You couldn't separate them. And it's only since the scientific revolution of the 18th century that there's been this bifurcation. Astronomy developing into this hard-headed, respectable science, and astrology devolving into this sort of esoteric and superstitious silliness. Our forebears, our pre-Enlightenment forebears, were a little bit more integrated. Lewis wants to suggest that they were still asking how questions at the same time as they were asking why questions. The what and the why and the who and the where, they were all intermingled, and the quantitative and the qualitative hadn't separated into these two camps, the two tribes that C.P. Snow writes about. Yes, this great divorce into the sciences and the humanities. So I think one of the things that Lewis is trying to encourage us to think about in his books, especially The Discarded Image, which is his introduction to medieval and Renaissance literature, is to get us to think about our categories. You know, why have we allowed science and art, science and humanities to be so separated from each other? Is that really healthy? Is that integrated? And the implied answer is, of course, no, not at all.
Well, and I would completely concur with you on that point, and I can also validate that I come from a very zealous religious background, a sect. Some would even consider my early affiliation to have been with a cult. I don't ascribe to that particular view, but we were very zealous and fundamentalist. But we ascribe to that view that, you know, astrology is something, you know, to stay far away from. And I've emerged from that to be more aligned with what you're sharing right now. I want to bring up one more scripture. You mentioned wandering stars earlier, and of course, Jude then immediately comes to mind with that powerful verse, right? Wandering stars, for whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever. There was a British musical group called I'm trying to remember their name right now. They were kind of an ambient group. They did a piece where they just quoted that over and over. A female voice. Pulp, I think, is the name of the group. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They were like post-punk, new age. I've spent a lot of time in music. But anyway, eerie and powerful song quoting that verse. But seems like now there might be more behind it that you could comment on. That verse from Jude about the wandering stars.
I can't comment on that particular verse, not having made any special study of Jude, but more generally, the idea that astrology can be good is something that Lewis is keen to defend. He points out how in the Middle Ages the church was very open to the idea that the planetary influences affected us. That was not the problem at issue. The danger became, well, the church stood out against three potential dangers, and they were obviously idolatry, planetolatry, worshipping the stars, regarding them as somehow divinities in their own right, that was to be obviously studiously avoided. The church also stood out against determinism, that the stars might give you a disposition. They might affect your temperament in a certain direction, but they weren't controlling you. They weren't overruling your free will and your responsibility before God. And in that sense, the idea of the planetary influence is pretty similar in essence, I think, to what we now in the modern 21st century would say about genetic inheritance. That, you know, we inherit certain genetic qualities from our parents and our forebears, which do indeed predispose us in various directions, which isn't to say that we're absolutely at their mercy. We can take steps to mitigate an unfortunate genetic inheritance, and not just, you know, genetic, but also you know, behavioral and psychological. And then the third thing that the church stood out against is what Lewis calls the lucrative and politically undesirable practice of astrologically grounded predictions. In other words, you know, you can see how astrology could easily be weaponized and monetized, that the court astrologer would go to the king and say, you know, go into battle next week against the French, and all the time he's in the pay of the French. He's a spy, and, you know, he's just manipulating people who are too credulous about this idea of astrological influence. So, of course, astrology can be misused, but as Lewis liked to say, one of his favorite Latin tags was abusus non tollit usum. Abuse does not abolish use. And just because astrology can go wrong doesn't mean it must go wrong and can only go wrong. I mean, astrology just literally means the study of the stars. We don't react in terror against words like biology or anthropology or geology. So why do we react against astrology? If we were going to react against a word, it would be astronomy, astronomy, because that means the law of the stars, as if there is indeed something determinative about them. And it's rather weird that
that's funny. It's funny how language works that way, that the one, you know, that the word that one should have been afraid of becomes the respectable word, and
yes,
vice versa. Isn't
it weird? Because nobody would think about geonomers or bionomers, biologists, yes, and geologists, but why don't we respect astrologists?
Well, you know, we're going to have to go to, I'm changing the format of the show. We're only going to do 2 segments on today's show, after all, for you and the audience, because this has been a rich and deep opening sequence. I want to bring up one more thing, and that is, again, I think it's from the book of Daniel, right, where the Nebuchadnezzar has this disturbing dream, and he asks his astrologers to interpret the dream. And they say, "Oh yeah, sure. Tell us what you dreamt, and we'll tell you what he means." He says, "No, I'm not playing that game, right?" And Daniel comes in with an interpretation where he actually knows what the king dreamt. So he has the authority that comes through divinely revealed knowledge. And the interplay there, if you read between the lines, is you can't trust those astrologers, because once they hear what the king's dream is, you know, they'll make something up that the king wants to hear. And he's maybe been around the block once or twice by that point.
Absolutely. But it's interesting how Jesus in the Gospels talks about the end times will be signified when the sun is darkened and the moon gives no light.
Amen. Yes.
And there's that,
and the stars will fall from heaven.
Yes. Right? And in the Psalms we are told about how the sun shall not smite you by day, nor the moon by night. Yeah. And that's a very intriguing verse. How can the moon smite you by night? It's pretty obvious how the sun could give you sunstroke or dehydrate you or give you skin cancer or something.
You could be moonstruck.
Well, exactly. Lewis liked the word moonstruck and moonshine, because, of course, he was buying into this idea that the moon would make you into a lunatic. That's where we get the word from. The lunar influence makes you mad. And why is that? It's because the moon is so changeable, that the moon waxes and wanes and sometimes disappears altogether, changes shape and size and color. is sort of lapping back and forth every month in a very sort of fluid fashion. So it's associated with the sort of instability of water. And so interestingly, in the New Testament, Jesus in Matthew's Gospel is twice shown to be healing lunatics. In the Greek, the word is seleniazomenous, those who have been selenized, because Selene is another name for the Greek goddess, for the lunar goddess in Greek. And it's unfortunate that modern translations of the Gospel sometimes translate that as not lunatics, but epileptics. There's a big difference between madness and epilepsy, as my epileptic friends would like to point out. And it's clearly linked to lunar influence in the Greek language. And it's another testimony to the idea that, yes, of course, we're not absolutely at the mercy of these planetary objects, but we are in relationship with them. They have some influences, they have some effects upon us, and I think that's hard in some ways to dispute, at least at the level of the sun and the moon, because it's pretty obvious how everybody feels brighter when the sun is up. You know, it just affects our constitution very naturally. And even the moon, when the moon is full and bright at night, you can almost see a shadow at sometimes, and you can go traveling more easily. You can even hunt at night. So you can see how Artemis and Diana, these goddesses of hunting, became associated with the moon. So these qualities are not arbitrary. They are fruitful consequences of people's imaginative engagement with the things that they're looking at. And of course, before the age of electricity, people knew the stars and the planets much better than we do now. I mean, we all rely on our GPSs. Most people these days don't know the stars and the planets. They can't navigate with celestial navigation, but our forebears knew them intimately. When you're in your dark little cottage, when night fell, what did you do? If it was still a warm night, you would go and sit on your porch and look up at the night sky, and that would be your television, that would be your Netflix, that would be your entertainment for the night. So of course people knew their things much better than we do.
You're pretty far north, but I actually went to high school up in Alaska, and for a period of time, 10 months, I actually lived in a tent. My viewers know this story. It's a long story. I won't get into it. But the point is, up there, you know, when I would go to school in the morning, it would be dark in the winter. When I would get out of school, it would be dark. You know, we weren't quite north of the Arctic Circle, so we didn't quite have the midnight sun. But definitely, you know, alcoholism, drug uses, addiction, all higher. And one of the reasons is this, you know, this 6 months of winter. So these things, you know, absolutely have an influence. But there we also had the Northern Lights, spectacular, unbelievable heavenly displays, also related to, you know, solar activity in some way. If I have my facts straight. But this has been an amazing first section, but there's so much more. We're going to go to a quick commercial break, and when we come back, we're going to dive into what C.S. Lewis was doing with those works about Narnia, and how his Christian theology was woven in. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of Michael Ward, Oxford scholar, on C.S. Lewis here on Created in the Image of God.
Soul Seeds is both a one-day community garden experience and an annual roadmap for integrating and revitalizing local communities. In a single day, Soul Seeds brings youth, families, residents, and volunteers together to transform underused space into a living garden, planting not just vegetables and flowers, but the seeds of service, self-reliance, and community. But Soul Seeds doesn't end in one day. It becomes an annual plan. Plant together, manage together through shared care, youth leadership, and community connection. And harvest together food, beauty, trust, and a stronger neighborhood. In honor of Earth Day, Soul Seeds helped restore an overgrown courtyard at a nursing and rehab center. In one day, volunteers cleared the space, transplanted a rose bush, and planted flowers, vegetables, and a tea garden. When we return the next week, residents were glowing with pride, already caring for the garden as their own. At New Fountains Apartments in Fitchburg, Wisconsin, a youth group called the Justice League asked for help building a raised bed garden. Even in pouring rain, they built the frame, filled it with soil, and planted the garden, showing that community grows strongest when people serve together, rain or shine. Led by the Royal Falcon Foundation and powered by partners including the Bridge to Kindness, Summit Credit Union, and the Belleville Community Health Improvement Project, Soul Seeds is now being piloted in Wisconsin and Ohio as a model for broader community and credit union engagement. One day can launch it. 1 year can sustain it. One community at a time, Soul Seeds helps neighbors plant, manage, and harvest a better future. Join us and grow with us.
Welcome back to the second half of today's show, where I'm here with Michael Ward, Oxford theologian and expert on C.S. Lewis. We've been talking about the seven heavens, the influence of the planets, the difference between astronomy and astrology, and it's just been fascinating for me. But for those of you who tuned in to know more about C.S. Lewis, this is the part you're not going to want to miss. So tell us a little bit about the framework of what C.S. Lewis was doing with his Narnia series.
Yes, he wrote the Narnia books in the 1940s and 50s. And he started out actually with the intention of writing just one book, and then it grew into a 7-part series. But that first book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, is connected in Lewis's imagination to the qualities of Jupiter, if I'm right about what Lewis was up to. And I came across this idea when I was halfway through my PhD studies. I was looking at Lewis's theological imagination. And I was aware that the Narnia Chronicles had perplexed Lewis scholars and critics for a long time, because on the surface, the books seem to be a bit chaotic. You've got English children alongside characters from Greek and Roman mythology, alongside this white witch character in the first book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, who's, you know, very much out of the pages of a Hans Andersen fairy tale. Then you've got Father Christmas. For goodness sake, what's he doing in the story? And famously, when C.S. Lewis read aloud the first few chapters of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to his great friend Tolkien, Tolkien reacted against it, and he thought, oh, these literary and mythological traditions, they don't belong in the same world. And he soon gave up trying to read them. Tolkien didn't know the Narnia books very well at all. But because Tolkien has become famous, his attitude to Narnia has become well known, and lots of scholars have sort of intensified and repeated his critique, saying, oh yeah, Lewis just slopped these books together any old how. He just grabbed anything that took his fancy, threw it into this glorious hold-all, this mix, and the books are only for children anyway, aren't they? So they can't have been written with any great imaginative seriousness. And there are two main problems with that attitude. One is that, I mean, the Narnia books have become some of the best-selling and most admired works of English fiction in the second half of the 20th century, and they've been translated into 40 languages and still selling millions of copies every year. We're just about to get a massive new Hollywood adaptation of The Magician's Nephew by Greta Gerwig, who's just about the leading female director in Hollywood at the moment. Is it really by slopping things together without much pattern and design that you happen accidentally to produce classics of fiction that last for generations? I don't think so. And if that were the correct answer, then that itself would need explanation, if you ask me. But that's only one problem. The more significant problem is that Lewis himself was not a characteristically random or slapdash writer or thinker. He was a very rigorous, consistent thinker. He had one of the most trained and disciplined minds of all time. I mean, you only need to look at his education under a man called William Kirkpatrick, who was this rigorous logician who demanded Lewis give reasons for every simple thing he said. It wasn't sufficient just to say, oh, the scenery in Surrey, this county in the south of England, is much wilder than I had supposed it to be. That was Lewis's sort of opening conversational gambit with his tutor when he first met him. And Kirkpatrick said, stop! What grounds did you have for thinking the scenery was such and such? and he sort of forced Lewis into not just making idle chit-chat. And Lewis throve under this treatment. He said it was, to him, red beef and strong beer. He loved it. And so the idea that he would then write Narnia books, which didn't have a good grounding, a good coherent imaginative blueprint, that's just alien to Lewis's whole mindset. Which is why quite a few Lewis scholars and critics have said, well, there must be an additional level of significance. We've got the plain story, the simple fairy tale level. You've got the pretty obvious biblical parallels between Aslan and Jesus. But what's the undergirding structure? And different theories have been suggested, like the 7 deadly sins and the 7 sacraments and the 7 traditional virtues and any 7 that people can think of, basically. And it was left to me to come up with the idea that, no, it's the 7 heavens, which are all over the rest of Lewis's writings, as we've been talking about. And I think one of the reasons that people hadn't considered the 7 heavens is, again, for what we were just talking about, this aversion, especially on the part of Christians, to anything that has to do with astrology. People just react against the very notion of astrology, and they think that, oh,
because
Lewis
it's funny when you have witches and all these other things in there, that it would be the astrology that people would be reacting to.
Well, they react to both, of course, and some people find The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe beyond the pale simply because it has a witch in it. Which always amuses me, because are they not aware that there is at least one witch in the Bible, the Witch of Endor?
The Witch of Endor, yeah.
Do you stop reading the Bible because that has a witch in it? Of course not. But the point is that...
but of course there, it's well known that Saul was not supposed to have sought her, but then he's not, Lewis is not portraying the witch as a good figure.
No, indeed, she is the complete antagonist and personification of evil. So, but the point is that scholars and critics of Lewis who knew more about Lewis than just the Narnia books, who read The Discarded Image and Lewis's study of the 16th century and so on, and who, looked at his fiction and poetry, which used the 7 heavens all over the place, I think a lot of them just thought, oh, it's just one of those things that a medievalist might be expected to do, but it didn't really mean much to him. And that's where this line that I've already quoted is so relevant, when Lewis says he doesn't just have an antiquarian interest in the 7 heavens. He believes them to be spiritual symbols of permanent value, which are especially worthwhile in his own generation. And he then goes on and adds, of Saturn we know more than enough, but who does not need to be reminded of Jove, of Jupiter? Now that's really important for The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, as it happens, because Saturn, as we've been saying, is the planet associated with death, old age, disaster. And when Lewis says of Saturn we know more than enough, he's referring to the fact that his own generation was the generation that went through the First World War, and 750,000 British servicemen were killed in that conflict. And Lewis himself was very nearly one of them. He was an officer in the First World War and was nearly blown up in the trenches of France in 1918.
I'm thinking here of Yeats' poem, The Second Coming, right? And the center does not hold as well in this context. Anyway, go ahead.
So of Saturn we know more than enough. And Lewis would sometimes talk about the culture of the 1920s and 30s as Saturnocentric, focused, fixated almost upon these Saturnine qualities of bleakness and cynicism and pessimism. a very natural response to the huge trauma of the First World War. But as he would like to point out to people, Saturn is not the only spiritual symbol. There are 6 others, and Saturn is certainly not the best. In fact, Saturn is the worst. Saturn is infortuna major, the greater infortune. Who does not need to be reminded of Jupiter? Because Jupiter is the kingly planet associated with all things royal and regal and monarchical. But we must think, he says, of a king at peace, enthroned, taking his leisure, serene, tranquil, festive, magnanimous, prosperous. Those are the sorts of kingly qualities that Jupiter sponsors. And so I was reading Lewis's long poem about the planets. He wrote this 122-line alliterative poem in the 1930s, so long before he wrote Narnia. And he's going into great detail in his own poetic language about the attributes of the 7 planets. And I'm lying in bed one night, it's about 11:30 at night. I'm reading this poem just before I turn the light out and go to sleep. And I'm reading the lines about Jupiter and Jupiter's influences. And I get to the words that Jupiter brings about winter past and guilt forgiven. And those 5 words leap off the page at me, winter past and guilt forgiven. And I suddenly think, well, that's like a 5-word summary of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Because in that story, winter passes. The White Witch has made it always winter, but never Christmas. This kingdom of ice and snow that has besieged Narnia for 100 years is a tyranny. This is not a good winter wonderland. This is bleakness. This is, you might say, Saturnocentricity, everything dead. But at the coming of Aslan, who is described as the king, the White Witch's winter disappears. When he shakes his mane, we shall have spring again. When he bares his teeth, winter meets its death. So winter passes and guilt is forgiven. That other line from the poem. Now, what's Jupiter got to do with the forgiving of guilt? Well, interestingly, in the same year that Lewis began writing The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, he wrote another book about his friend Charles Williams, who was one of the Inklings. And in that book, which is called Arthurian Torso, and most people haven't heard of it, let alone read it, but in that book, Lewis, examining the poetry of his great friend Charles Williams, examines a poem where Williams had written about Jupiter's red-pierced planet. And that's an allusion to the great red spot, the great eye of Jupiter, which is a storm perpetually raging on the surface of Jupiter. And in Williams's imagination, this is now Lewis speaking in his book Arthurian Torso, Jupiter, thus wounded, becomes another archetype, another reflection of the divine king wounded on Calvary. The planet of kingship, Jupiter, is itself wounded, like Christ, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, on the cross of Calvary. So that shows us that Lewis very explicitly connects Jupiter symbolism with the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, which of course he's reworking at the heart of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, when Aslan dies on the stone table for the sake of the treacherous Edmund, and then is brought back to life because of the deeper magic. So that was, anyway, I'm probably giving you more information than you need, but the point is that...
No, this is amazing. I'm just enthralled here. This is awesome.
That was what connected, for the first time, in my mind, the Narnia books with the planets. I saw this connection between The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe and Jupiter, who does not need to be reminded of Jove, as Lewis said. And I thought, oh, is he using jovial symbolism to construct the plot, the atmosphere, the details, and most importantly, from the theological point of view, the portrayal of his Christ character? Because Aslan is repeatedly described as the king. He's not safe, but he's good because he is the king. He's the king of the wood. He's the king of the beasts. He's got a royal pavilion, a royal stand, and all these royal accoutrements. We hear repeatedly about his Father, the emperor over the sea. There are more references to the emperor over the sea in this first book than in all the other Chronicles put together. So there's a huge emphasis upon the kingly nature of Aslan in this first book. And that was sufficient for me to start thinking, well, there are another 6 planets. There are another 6 Chronicles of Narnia. Is it possible that they all link up? And it was very easy to see that they did. And they just sort of slotted into place, bing, 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 bing. And I thought, this is it. This is what people have been looking for all these years. All these theories about the 7 deadly sins and the 7 sacraments, they were wild goose chases. But the 7 heavens, which, as I've been saying, are all over Lewis's writings, are very naturally being drawn upon in these 7 Chronicles to give Lewis the shape and the structure and the feel and the flavor of each book. But, and this is the important point, hidden. Spiritual things are spiritually discerned, and Lewis is not going to make it obvious. You have to have ears to hear and eyes to see.
So, regrettably, we are already out of time. I'm going to extend an invitation for you to return. And I hope you'll take us up on it, because I feel like we've just peeled back 2 layers of the onion. Right? We've described what the onion is in the first part of today's show, and now we've revealed a little bit of the flavor and the savor of it. But I'm incredibly intrigued. I was going to ask just one more question in the time we have remaining, and you've answered it already. Lewis, why wouldn't Lewis ever share this? Well, it's wonderful that he didn't. It's amazing that it took that long, but that you've uncovered it. And I hope you'll accept the invitation to come back so we can dive deeper into it. But given that we're out of time, what sadly crash landing this plane right now, what parting words would you have for our audience at this time in terms of where would they start? Should they just pick up The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Should they pick up your book to understand more about it if they're familiar already with the Narnia series?
Well, if they are not familiar with the Narnia series, they obviously should start there, and they should start with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, not with The Magician's Nephew. The Magician's Nephew is sometimes labeled as the number 1, but actually it's number 6, and it shouldn't be read first. It's a sort of prequel or flashback. It's not really the introduction to the septet. The introduction is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So read that first and read all the Narnia books. And then if you want to know more, then I've written this book, Planet Narnia. But it must be said, the Planet Narnia is a big, thick book with a lot of detail. And
a tome. Is it a tome?
Yeah, it's readable, I think. But if you just want the sort of summary account of the argument, then I've written a much shorter book, a simpler, more popular level book, which I think is more accessible to the average person, and that's just called The Narnia Code. And if you don't even like short books, I did the BBC asked me to do a 1-hour TV documentary about this whole theory, and that is also called The Narnia Code, and you can get that online or on DVD.
I will certainly commit to going and reviewing that BBC documentary gladly, in the hopes of having you back on the show to talk about it. We are sadly out of time. I mean, I'd love to keep going. Thank you so much, Michael Ward, for being with us this morning. You've certainly whetted my appetite, and I'm sure that of the audience, to know more. And as soon as we know about Michael's potential return to the show, we'll be announcing it. Any last comments as we wrap up today?
No, except to thank you for having me, and to say yes, in principle, I'd certainly love to come back, and we can talk about the whole notion of hiddenness and why Lewis would do this and do it secretly. Because I think a lot of people find it hard to believe that Lewis would have wanted to keep a secret, and B, could have kept a secret of this nature. And if it's secretive, does it really matter in any case? And those are good questions, and I think there are good answers, and we could get into that next time.
Well, perhaps they have something to do with the prophet Isaiah. A more famous person than C.S. Lewis said, that's why he spoke in parables.
Yes, surely thou art a God that hidest thyself. Yes.
Well, amazing. Michael, thank you so much. And I look forward to continuing this conversation. For everybody else, remember, you are created in the image of God. God loves his creation. Stay tuned for the sneak peek, and we'll see you next week. Bye for now.
Next week on Created in the Image of God. Sunday, September 6th at 7 a.m. U.S. Central Time. Host Wade Franson interviews Jared Bias, writer, speaker, and co-founder of the Bible for Normal People. He explores how we can approach faith in Scripture with curiosity, making room for honest questions without relying on rigid answers or easy certainties. From doubt and belonging to discovering a deeper, more thoughtful and connected life with God. And then on Tuesday, September 8th at 8 p.m. Central Time, host Wade Franson interviews Amy Peeler, New Testament scholar, pastor, and author. She explores Scripture through questions of gender, holiness, and the family of God, and what it means for men and women to understand themselves as God's children. From the book of Hebrews and biblical interpretation to a deeper understanding of identity, belonging, and life in the family of God. Join us live this week, Tuesday and Sunday, Created in the